Dan, how are you doing today?
I'm great, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, and thank you for coming in early ahead of our roundtable here in London, trying to do 101 things, but I knew I had to sit down with you and have a bit of a chit-chat about story time, data story time. And before we dive into your story that you're going to tell me today, set the scene for me. What does a CDO at Captial One look like?
Yeah, well, it's funny you say 1,000,001 things, because that's definitely kind of the definition of my role, really. So everything from how do we make sure that the data that we capture about our customers is well protected, easy to find, deleted when it should be, all the way through to how do we look to use that data in a way that opens up value, and everything in between. So thinking about data culture, and also thinking about how do we build, retain amazing data teams.
Well, the latter point, here at Orbition, we know a fair bit about, but wow, that is a huge remit. It's really interesting, actually. I get to chat to so many different data leaders, and some are a little bit more niche, but that's broad. So I'm going to have to contain myself and jot down a note, contain myself for our conversation here today, Dan. Now, the story, well, let's set the scene for the audience. We had a few emails back and forth, and I said, hey, let's do an interview. You said, yeah, great, what should we talk about? And I always find it really interesting to give people a little bit of a moment, because there's always going to be that natural reaction of we can talk about. But if I allow people to have a bit of a meditate and think about it, I think something really interesting arises. And for you, it's a story about how you use data to prioritize features in an app, right?
Yep, absolutely, yeah.
Why, and before we get into it, why did that story come to mind for you that you wanted to talk about it in this conversation compared to all the other stories that you could tell me?
Yeah, and you're right, there was all kinds of things that went through my mind, whether it was kind of high-level strategic stories or kind of people-based stories. But actually what I like about this particular example is it's a really good use case of how actually you can use data in a way that everybody can understand the output. It's not about complex algorithms, although there are complex algorithms involved, but it's really about what's the insight that you get from that data, and then how does that drive the business forward.
Yeah. So what we've done there is we've given the audience a bit of a tease as to the end result. So let's now drag right back to the start. Before we even talk about the data that you used to prioritize the features in this app, why an app? What are we doing here? What's the business case for this whole conversation to begin with?
Of course, so Captial One in the UK, a big credit card lender, and a big part of that is making sure that our customers have really good access to the actual current status of their credit card, where they are in terms of transactions or payments. And actually, kind of if I go back 7 or 8 years ago, we took the decision to in-house the building of our mobile app to make sure that we had control of what features were in there, but also we could move in a very agile way. And so that was the kind of background to this. Now the problem when you do that is there's 1,000,001 different things that you could build into that mobile app. And actually the challenge that was set to us was, we've got a big long list, but what would our customers actually find the most useful?
Yeah, and exactly that. And I think often you see on LinkedIn these different visualizations of data tools, and they look really, really sexy. And then you actually think about ones that get used really often. I'm thinking of Google Analytics, which I feel personally victimized at the moment with our website, because they just think everything in the kitchen sink. And I think that is the last thing we want to do to our own customers, because as you say, there's so many things, like especially on all the data points that we collect on a customer and how I may want to interact with you, so much. So to actually prioritize that so it doesn't look overwhelming and hideous is really, really important. So talk me through the journey. What data did you use to start prioritizing these features?
So a big part of that was to go, why are customers using the app in the first place? Or actually, more importantly, why are customers not using the app, and instead maybe calling in to our call center instead? Now, it depends on the customer. A customer may not want to use the app, and actually their preferred channel is to call in. But actually, if you've got people calling in who would rather do that particular thing in the app, then it's wasting our customers' time. It's also wasting our time as well. And so that was really the starting point for, are there particular features that customers aren't able to use at the moment, but instead they're dialing in.
Yeah.
And so in order to do that, there was a really helpful data source, which is let's look at those conversations for when the customers are actually calling in. Now, instead of going straight to the actual kind of voice recording side, instead, anytime a customer is talking to one of our agents, the agent makes some notes about what the conversation is, what were the things the customer was asking for, and then what did the agent do in response to that. And that was a really rich, detailed data source that we could actually start to use to understand what are some of the appetite that the customers have calling in.
Now I'm going to pause you there because you've said something and I just want to drag it out to make sure the audience heard it. You just said there, we're not going to jump straight into the voice recording. We're not going to jump straight into NLP and doing all the fancy stuff. Actually, we're going to come that step back and just use the notes. And I think that is so crucial in this story, that you didn't go as complex as you could. And I'm sure you're going to tell me you did end up doing that. But you started out with at least being able to do this kind of bucket activity of putting people into should have been in on the app, wants to use the app, doesn't want to use an app, never will use an app, and all the other buckets of people, so that you can start to kind of understand the lay of the land before then going into it. But sorry to jump in on you there, but I just wanted to draw that out because I think this is where so many people do fall down, is that they go straight to the most complex thing that's going to give them loads of data, but actually could you start setting the scene a little bit for the business and getting that return of investment quite quickly as well?
100% agree with you. For me, I think a successful data scientist or CDO or anyone who's working in data profession, it should be around pragmatic results.
Yeah.
It's not all about I'm going straight to the most shiny thing that I can find. It's about the thing that actually helps.
So when you started going through all of those notes from your call handlers and you were starting to build that picture, what was it telling you? Was it telling you what you thought from the business understanding and from your understanding of the customers already? Did it kind of cement that? Were there any new stories that arose where you thought, oh, we've not considered that, that's a new area that we need to look into? What was kind of the next step from that?
Yeah, so the first step was okay, so we've got the data, but actually there needs to be some work done on that. As with all data, you never get kind of the clean data that you can just pinpoint at stuff straight away. And there were various issues to solve. So firstly, a lot of the notes that the agents were using, it's not your standard English, because they would use kind of abbreviations or terminology. So you'd have to kind of deal with that. The second thing is also that because we're very careful about our customers' data, we had already pre-stripped out a lot of information that was personally identifiable or potentially just that we didn't want to touch, basically. And so that means you've got to get around that issue as well. And so quite a lot of cleaning that you had to do, and then we went through a process of clustering that data and trying to pick out themes. And we ended up with a really nice kind of stacked bar chart of categorization of calls that we could then look at and go, can we label what each of these clusters look like? And what we found was actually the biggest cluster was all related to payments. So customers calling in to make a payment. Now at that point, we had not heavily invested in putting payments into our app functionality, and so this was a kind of a really clear signal of, hey, there's a real need here. Customers are feeling the need to call into our call centers and make payments. What if we could just make that for them in the app?
Yeah, and I guess it's one of those things that, as you say, but about the investment piece, that's not going to be a cheap thing to do. Right, we know that that's going to require resources, but if you've got the data telling you that, you can go and then say, right, this is what we need to invest in. That is way more powerful than just going, I think this would be good, or I've seen other competitors, or all of these other things that you can say, but actually going in there with a stack of data and being able to say, this is the results, this is what we need to do. There's a lot more confidence in that, I think, for you sitting at the table with the exec and the budget and everything that you require going into that. And I also want to pick up on the point of privacy by design being really integral to this process as well. Something that I know we have a few wild CISOs that engage in our content, and I know there's going to be a flurry of hearts and emojis to that piece as well there, Dan. So you've found the clusters, you know what you need to do with the payments, you've prioritized those features using data. Love it. What was then the next piece of the story?
So we then took that back to the mobile app team, and what was great was this wasn't a big surprise to them. You know, they had on their roadmap that they knew they needed to build in payment functionality into the app, but what this did was helped prioritize that backlog and bring this thing to the front. It gave them a really good case with which to talk about the rationale for that change, and then the team just went ahead and did it. And so kind of over the course of a few sprints, built in that functionality, put in kind of iterative versions, but actually now that payment functionality is a key part of our mobile app, and actually we saw the impact of that in terms of a reduction into our call center as well. So great news for customers, great news for us.
Yeah, and I love the idea of just like that, like click your fingers, it's done. I mean, we know there was a lot of work. That don't you worry, you're speaking to the right audience who knows how much work you would have done to get that up off the ground. And you mentioned there, good for the customers, good for you. And I think there's lots of areas here where we can talk about how data really does infiltrate into so many different departments within a business. You've got the marketing effort. Happy customers equals a good marketing story and a good way to go out to new customers as well. Especially in the space that you're operating in, you've got to go careful with how you do that as well. But it's far easier to have that good message. And as you say, for the call center, they want to be spending their time troubleshooting, problem solving, doing the work that requires a human on the other end of the phone. Taking payments and processes, not a good use of time for anyone involved, for sure. Now, you mentioned that you didn't go straight for the sexy thing right at the beginning, but was there any use of NLP in your process as you were designing this out?
Sure. So we used some basic parts of NLP, so we definitely looked at using some stemming and lemmatization to really kind of reduce the vocabulary of the notes that we were looking at to make it much easier to cluster. But actually that was something we were able to use some pretty standard packages and really just part of the process that we did.
Yeah. So now that you can kind of step away from this story and you're thinking about it and you're looking at it and you're clearly quite fond of this story and you think, oh yeah, that was a good career piece for sure. Is there anything you look back on and you think, with distance, I'd like to do this slightly different, or perhaps now you'd want to do like a version 2 and kind of grow this initiative? Having that space with this story, what is your thoughts there?
Yeah, and so part of the reason I like this is I think it's a really good example of where data science consultancy can really help, because you're bringing the skills to the data, to the business problem, and actually that's the bit that I get excited about. And so whilst the core of what we do at Captial One within our data science team is very much focused on credit scoring and credit risk, I think looking for those opportunities to jump in and use some different data sources and apply some of those techniques, that's great. I love that, and actually I don't feel like we do enough of that, and so any opportunity to find more ways to do that, I'm definitely up for.
I love the word you use there around consulting, because I know I can predict some of the questions we'll get from the audience here. What have you done anything in particularly special? Have you done anything particularly special is what I want to say, with regards to getting that seat at the table? You clearly have a lot of clout and power in the executive board. I think that goes without saying. What have you done to ensure that data has a seat at the table to have that consulting voice? Because let's be honest, none of this can happen unless they in the business go, oh, I wonder what data has to say about this, and including them in the process. So have you done anything special in that area? Is it just the culture of Captial One? What's going on there?
So I think the culture is a big part of that. Data and analytics is the bedrock for a lot of what we do. But actually I think there are a few things that have helped. So firstly, pragmatism. I think really focusing on things that can actually have a real impact on business decisions, rather than this kind of ivory tower, I'm just going to go away and spend 2 years on some deep learning solution. It's really around how do you get some real results quickly. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I think is track record. So if you're able to provide value over and over again, it builds credibility for the team, and it builds credibility for what you're trying to achieve as a data leader.
Yeah. You say there about building results quite quickly. How do you balance that with the stuff that really is going to make a huge impact? It's going to take a bit of time, we know it is, but there's also elements that you can have those quick wins. How do you as a CDO balance the requirement to show that you are adding business value, that you're bringing them on this journey, but then in the background you're also working on the things that do require a bit more heavy lifting.
And it is a balance, because I don't think you can have one or the other and succeed. If you're just delivering short-term wins, you're never going to get to where you need to get to. If it's all about the long-term, people lose patience. So that there is definitely a balance required, and I think that is one of the challenges on a CDO, is to make sure you're protecting both those areas and deliveries. Having a clearly defined data strategy helps, because if you've got that written down in a document, you can point to it and say, this is where we're taking the business longer term, and this is why it's important. But then the other thing is making sure that you have those connections with the other parts of the organisation, so that they don't feel like they're just sat waiting for this 5-year time horizon.
Yeah. Well, I love the idea of using the strategy, because in many businesses I think it sits on a shelf and gathers dust. So I like the idea of you occasionally pulling it off and just blowing the dust away and saying, nope, this is still the plan. This was the plan all along, and we're still making good on that. You mentioned at the start, when you gave your intro, about the broad spectrum in which you lead, and you mentioned there about the talent analytics capabilities. Now, obviously, I've got a vested interest in that, so I'm going to ask you about it. All of this cannot happen unless you have a decent data team. What is, in 2023, Dan looking for in top talent?
In a word, curiosity. I think on the technical skill side, that's something that we can teach, that's something that people can learn. What's much harder to teach is that curiosity, that ability to ask questions, to understand why, and to be a bit relentless when it comes to digging for the truth. If I'm honest, kind of when it comes to interviewing, that's the key quality that I'm looking for in new great data talent.
Yeah. And how are you finding that? Is it something that you're finding quite easily? Is it a journey that you're struggling on? What's that like at the moment in the market?
It's actually a little bit freeing, because I think what it allows you to do is to step beyond the kind of traditional specification that you might have for data talent. We've actually found a whole load of benefit, not just in the wider market, but looking inside our organisation. So we have people who have been on the phone talking to customers, who have a real passion for data and learning new skills, and being able to create roles for them within the organisation, help them to build those skills. That's one great source, because these people know your processes, they know your customers.
I love that, and it always surprises people, I think, when they hear from a talent solution company that we love hearing about upskilling internal staff, because it's something that we see so much value in, because, as you say, they've got that understanding of the business, and they also understand the pain points. So when you say, hey, we're going to try and solve this, they're like, oh my goodness, thank you, because that is so annoying, and you're actually kind of moving the needle on that. Whereas if you do go from kind of the traditional technical routes forwards, they're very, very knowledgeable in their area, but there may be kind of a bit of a gap and barrier between then those business pain points, and why you may not do the most sexy thing, but actually simple works, because simple has a good ROI on it.
Yeah, but it's always a blend, right? So I think one of the things you do want to make sure is you're continuing to freshen up your data organisation, and that's where bringing in people from different industries or with different experiences and perspectives is helpful as well.
Yeah, for sure. Now, Dan, we've spoken about a lot in this story time. So, for our audience, what is the one key message that you would like them to bring with them after they've finished this episode with us here today?
So I think my key message is keep asking why. Really get down to what is the business need that you're trying to solve here, because the data, the analytics, the tools, the talent will all follow, and you'll get success as long as you really get down to what actually matters.
Amazing. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great, thank you.